When Virginia Johnson first joined William Masters in 1957, she had been a young mother without a degree or training.
He wanted someone whose mind was an open, was a fresh page that he could write on or that he could draw from.
Masters had been seeking an assistant, but very rapidly, Virginia Johnson developed into a protege and ultimately a full-fledged partner in William Masters' research.
It was a gift that he gave me, but I think it served him well. He really gave me quite equal status. He made me earn it, but at the same time, he was never reluctant to give it. He realized that to do the work he was going to do required a man and a woman cast in the role of the traditional couple, and he couldn't have been more right.
The need for a man-woman team was particularly important in their second phase of research. Since 1959, along with their physiological studies, Masters and Johnson had been working to develop a therapy for treating sexual problems. Their approach was radically different from previous psychotherapies. Masters and Johnson treated couples, not individuals, believing that in sexual problems there is no such thing as an uninvolved partner. Couples came to St. Louis for an intensive 2-week program of daily therapy, rather than years of weekly treatment. The couple was seen by a team of 2 therapists, a man and a woman. Therapists gave couples homework assignments to practice back in their hotel room, behavior modification techniques to treat the sexual problem itself, and sensate focus exercises designed to help couples enjoy sensual feelings without pressure to perform sexually. In 1970, Masters and Johnson detailed their procedures and results in their second book, Human Sexual Inadequacy. The most startling result of all was, it worked. The new therapy showed success rates of more than 80%, compared to about 20% for traditional psychotherapy. The psychiatric community was stunned that an obstetrician-gynecologist and an uncredentialed woman had been able to succeed where they had not.
They just couldn't believe that one could reverse lifelong premature ejaculation in a matter of weeks. They just couldn't believe that a woman who hadn't had orgasms for 25 years after less than 2 weeks of treatment suddenly might not only have orgasms, but might actually have multiple orgasms.
Their contribution really can't be overestimated. It was enormous. And it really did change, for most of us, how we approach sexual problems, how we assessed sexual problems, and how we treated sexual problems.
The mass media gave human sexual inadequacy front-page coverage, spreading the word that for the first time, couples with long-standing sexual problems could be helped. People flocked to St. Louis from all over the globe to what was, in 1970, the only sex therapy clinic in the world. But that was about to change. Human sexual inadequacy presented such a clear methodology for the treatment of sexual problems that it gave birth to an entire new industry.
Basically, that book launched sex therapy as a specialty. I mean, and the number of sex therapists, sex clinics, dual sex therapy teams that sprang up within a year of publication of their book was enormous.
Many new therapists were trained by Masters and Johnson, either at their clinic or in workshops they gave across the country.
Contrasting my psychotherapy work before I joined Masters and Johnson, I certainly didn't see the kind of progress with couples that I saw when I worked at Masters and Johnson. And the part that was so astounding was that you saw changes within 2 weeks, and profound changes that
As successful as the new therapy was, it still came in for some criticism. The press seized on the fact that for a small number of single male patients, Masters and Johnson had employed surrogates, women who were trained to perform as sex partners.
The general press regarded these as simply prostitutes. To Masters and Johnson, there were women who had been specially trained in psychotherapy, and I don't think Masters and Johnson recognized how much of a bombshell it was going to be.
Masters and Johnson soon dropped the use of surrogates. Then, in later years, some psychotherapists challenged Masters and Johnson's success rates and methods of reporting their statistics.
Some of the criticisms that were brought up were legitimate, but some of the same people who were writing these articles criticizing their work were developing programs and clinics and so on based entirely on the Masters and Johnson program. So really, when you look back on it, I think it was a tempest in a teapot what the exact numbers were.
With the success of their new sex therapy, Masters and Johnson became a part of popular culture.
Look, friend, people go to St. Louis other than to see Doctors Masters and Johnson. It's not for me, but I'd like a copy of Human Sexual Inadequacy.
As the founders of this new field, with a 2-year waiting list at their St. Louis clinic, Masters and Johnson were in a position to capitalize on their unique status. They were inundated with offers to put their names on everything from perfume to underwear, to start franchises of their clinic, even to sell the movie rights to their books.
All the way through, they both had the guiding vision of turning those down, of not even entertaining for a moment anything that they felt would taint the work. And of course, it was at huge personal cost. They could have made tens of millions of dollars.
Not all of the new sex therapists were as principled as Masters and Johnson. It was the early 70s. The sexual revolution was in full flower, the era of free love and swinging singles. A number of people hung out shingles as sex therapists who weren't fully qualified, or even worse, who engaged in sex with their clients.
Will come into your head.
But in spite of a few excesses, and with the introduction of certification for sex therapists, sex therapy helped thousands of couples beginning in the 1970s.
The field of psychosexual therapy has developed. We know more today. We are talking about different issues. I use fantasies a lot, but the basic foundation has been laid by Masters and Johnson.
Masters and Johnson were the first couple of sex therapy. Meanwhile, their partnership had become more than just a professional one. From the time he began his research into sex in the mid-50s, William Masters had set a pace of 80-hour weeks. As the years wore on and the workload grew, he spent more and more time with his work and less time with his family. His most constant companion was no longer his wife, Elizabeth, but rather the partner with whom he shared his life's work.
We were together all that time, 7 days a week, and we traveled together all the time. It doesn't take a lot of insight to realize that this was somewhat devastating to his marriage, and the fact that his focus in life was achieving the work he set out to do.
In 1968, William Masters and his wife divorced. 3 years later, after working together for 14 years, he and Virginia Johnson were married. The ceremony was small and private, but as celebrities, their change of status was widely noted in the media.
May I ask each of you how many times each of you has been married?
I've been married. This is my second marriage.
This is my third.
Well, then let me ask you what you mean by commitment and what makes one
That's
commit. I mean, one
fair
could look at you and say, aha, you know, you're supposed to be the great authority, you've been married 3 times.
Being married had no effect on the pace of their work at the Research Foundation. Masters and Johnson continued to do research and writing, treated couples with problems, and provided training for therapists.
It was not unusual to work a 20-hour day. There were showers in our office suite so that if you worked pretty much through the night, you could shower and change clothes and be ready to go after a 2-hour nap, perhaps.
As the 1970s wore on, one sexual trend was becoming increasingly evident: society's greater openness toward homosexuality. Masters and Johnson had studied sexual response in homosexuals from the beginning. By 1979, they had assembled enough cases to publish their findings. In Homosexuality in Perspective, Masters and Johnson reported that sexual functioning was no different in homosexuals than in heterosexuals. They maintained that homosexuality was not a disease, but rather a learned behavior. They reported that homosexual couples, particularly lesbian couples, often had a better understanding of their partner's needs than heterosexual couples did. But one aspect of their research drew particular attention. Masters and Johnson reported that they had been able to help some homosexuals convert to heterosexuality.
The most provocative part of your study and the controversy say that homosexuals can be converted to heterosexuality within 2 weeks in a training program. Is that an accurate statement?
When you make the statement that we say one can convert or revert people to heterosexuality, it sort of gives the wrong impression, possibly the wrong impression, that we believe this should be done. And we don't. We certainly think the procedure should be available to those homosexuals who specifically request the reversal, but not just for homosexuality per se.
I think it's equally important that our therapy program is offered for those homosexuals who wish to be functional in their homosexual relationship as well, by their choice.
But the conversion therapy opened the book up to attack. Some maintained that the people treated were bisexual, not homosexual. Others felt that the whole idea of converting was wrong, that it implied that being straight was better than being gay.
The book had really had its impetus more than a decade earlier, and the political climate shifted. The gay rights movement, the gay pride movement, had come a long way in the preceding dozen years or so. And the book wasn't written with an ear to phraseologies and nuances that were politically important. And so it made many people in many different camps uncomfortable.
Masters and Johnson realized that they had expressed themselves poorly in the book.
We failed to, I guess, describe sufficiently the fact that these were highly motivated people. So if someone had said, oh, you're making all of these gay men and gay women bisexual, well, that might have been closer to the truth, but it was on the basis of their deep and abiding desire for reasonably stated cause to want to be able to live comfortably and effectively in a heterosexual relationship.
Virginia Johnson was by now one of the preeminent names in sex research, a field she helped create. In 1987, she received her second honorary Ph.D. in a ceremony at the University of Rochester. But the lack of a real doctorate haunted her throughout her career.
More often than not, they presumed, they insisted I already had one. My name in programs would either have an MD or PhD, and my opening line on every presentation was, I must tell you, I do not.
Johnson made occasional attempts to obtain her degree, but Masters always prevailed on her not to abandon their work.
The thing that helped me tolerate the state, especially when he was yanking me back out of programs in which I was enrolled, that I had people of such note, people whose names are famous in their fields, who'd say, you have been doing plumbing for a long while, why do you need a plumber's license?
Through the 1970s and early 80s, Masters and Johnson remained the foremost names in sex research. But now, their hard-earned reputation was about to suffer a terrible blow. By the mid-1980s, a new sexual issue had overshadowed all others, the epidemic of AIDS. At the time, little was known about the disease and how it was transmitted. Masters and Johnson and their colleague Robert Kolodny became convinced that the U.S. government was putting a lid on discussion of AIDS among heterosexuals.
This book is our attempt to pull back the veil of secrecy from the, quote, official, unquote, positions about AIDS, and to let the public know what many scientists privately worry about, but have thus far been too timid to come forth in public and say.
Crisis, Heterosexual Behavior in the Age of AIDS was published in 1988. The book issued a warning that heterosexual spread of the AIDS virus constituted a major threat to public health. In the book, Masters, Johnson, and Kolodny estimated that twice as many Americans were infected with the AIDS virus as the government's official estimate. They also examined various theoretical possibilities of heterosexual transmission, including forms of casual contact, from mosquito bites to toilet seats. The earlier controversy about homosexuality was nothing compared to the firestorm of criticism that greeted the book's release.
I think it's a disservice to the American people. It goes against every other scientific thing that I know about.
Without data, without information, they have implied that the virus spreads in other ways than we know it spreads.
They use words that are inflammatory. They also talk about an exploding epidemic in the heterosexual population. There is no evidence for that at all.
At the press conference for the book, Masters, Johnson, and Kolodny were savaged by the media.
And no, I don't think it's hysteria.
Yes,
you use this to recognize.
Very
germane. Can you tell us whether the
As a matter of fact, no. I did speak out.
You asked a question, and we are trying to answer it.
At this stage of the game, the threat is just starting.
In retrospect, we would have certainly, with the insight, changed some phrasings, changed some words, attempted to tone down anything that might have been called then alarmist. We thought we were issuing a wake-up call. You have to remember that just a few years before our book came out, scientists were still arguing about whether heterosexual transmission was possible in the United States. It's hard today to recall that, but that was the case.
Masters and Johnson's reputation suffered from the controversy over their AIDS book. Meanwhile, their very success in promoting sex therapy meant that their institute was no longer the only game in town. The time to capitalize on their fame and stature had long since passed them by.
Well, Dr. Masters still was an ivory tower scientist in the best possible connotation of that. That's his attitude and approach. I like things to grow, and it was long past time to bring forth a commercial element of this.
In his mid-70s and suffering from the early stages of Parkinson's disease, Bill Masters still lived for his work. He joined a young associate in a program to deal with sexual abuse of children and continued to give lectures across the country. For Virginia Johnson, however, 35 years of 7-day weeks had taken their toll.
I wanted a different kind of life. I was longing for social life. I was longing to be a person, and not someone that everybody kind of says, oh, gee, there she is, which has its pluses, but it's not very much fun. You don't get to go play.
The difference in priorities between William Masters and Virginia Johnson proved too much for their relationship, and in 1991, they divorced.
We both realized that the intensity of the work and the things that had bonded us together no longer existed. So it was something we both concurred in.
2 years later, in 1993, Bill Masters remarried. His third wife, Dodie, was a friend from his college and medical school days. They took up summer residence at the same Adirondack cabin where they first met over half a century ago. Virginia Johnson began enjoying more of the social life she had missed, often in the company of a new companion and business partner, Lee Zingale. and she was able to spend more time with her children and grandchildren. Others have continued to improve upon the research and therapy concepts that Masters and Johnson began developing back in the 1950s, but their work still remains at the core of sex research and sex therapy to this day.
One cannot overestimate the contribution of Masters and Johnson to our whole concept of sexuality, to the way we approach sexual problems and dysfunctions.
Without these two people and their passion and their work ethic and their intelligence and their courage of doing something that has not been done before, the whole methodology of psychosexual therapy could not have developed.
We existed because of the times, not in spite of them. We would have lasted maybe 2 or 3 months or until the word got around, and we would have been closed down and thrown out. But the need was permeating society so intensely. And on the part of the couples, the people themselves, what do I do about it? What do I do when it doesn't work?
But there must be 100,000 individuals who at one time or another now are doing some form or other of sex therapy. And I can remember when there were 2.
Just a few blocks from Virginia Johnson's house is the St. Louis Walk of Fame, a sidewalk honoring the city's most famous sons and daughters. The Walk of Fame includes 69 individuals: Charles Lindbergh, Stan Musial, Chuck Berry, and there is one duet, Masters and Johnson. Inscription on their plaque proclaims that William Masters and Virginia Johnson profoundly affected American society. An understatement.